So today we're kicking off what I like to call season 2 of a series that we actually began at the end of last year in December. It is called The Power of the Name of Jesus. And just in case you're new here or you weren't here for the first installment of this series, let me kind of catch you up, give you the big picture idea of this series. The big picture idea is this: names almost inherently seem to have a little bit of power in them. Names have power to describe us, okay? If you introduce yourself as Dr. So-and-so, that describes something about you, right? What you do, who you are, maybe the influence that you have, and how you can help people. Names also have power in them to endear us. Anybody have like a pet name or a nickname for somebody you're really close to that you love? Way back when I was in college, I had a nickname that a lot of my buddies would call me. So my name is Zach. It's spelled the proper way, okay? Z-A-C-H, not Z-A-C-K. And so I had these buddies, and they would actually say my name phonetically. So they would say Zach. And whenever I heard that, I knew that I was in the company of people who loved me and cared for me. It was kind of an endearing nickname. Now, kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, names also have power to disparage us. If you have ever been on the receiving end of a bully, you know what I'm talking about. Because they'll call you names: fat, dumb, worthless, loser. Those names can kind of burn a hole in your soul. They have power over you. Names have the power to reveal something to us, what people do and do not know about you. Every once in a while, I'll get a phone call from an unknown caller, and every once in a while, not all the time, but sometimes I'll pick it up. And I know I'm in trouble when the voice on the other end of the line says to me something like, "Is this Mr. McIntosh?" Because it's at that point I know that they don't know me from Adam, because that's not how you pronounce my last name. Names almost inherently, how you use them, what you say about them, they have power. And that's part of the reason that we're doing this series, because if one person has a lot of names, it's Jesus. In fact, in the New Testament, he has all sorts of names. In the New Testament, he is called the King, he is called the Word, he is called the Lord, he is called the Messiah, he is called the Lion, he is called the Lamb. Today, we're going to be focusing on a particular name of Jesus, the name of I Am. And all of these names of Jesus, we believe, have a lot of power to actually affect and change and transform our lives. And so today, as we kick off the second installment, season 2 of this series, we're going to be taking a look at that name, I Am. Now, out of all the names that we're looking at for Jesus, this is maybe the strangest, because in a lot of ways, it doesn't even sound like a name, right? It sounds like an introduction to a name, right? I wouldn't say I am, I would say I am Zach. You wouldn't say I am, you would say I am, and then whatever your name is. But for Jesus, this is actually a name, and this name reveals something profound about who he is. And so what we're going to do to get at this name is we're going to work through those two stories that I read to you just a couple of minutes ago. One from Exodus 3, and the other one from John chapter 8. And we'll start with the second story first, from John chapter 8. And I'll begin just by setting a little bit of context here for you, okay? In John chapter 8, Jesus, he's in the city of Jerusalem, and he's at kind of the center of theological gravity for the ancient Jews. He's at the temple in the city of Jerusalem. And he's in this debate and disputes with these detractors, people who are suspicious of Jesus, they're skeptical of him. And in the middle of this debate with his detractors, Jesus makes what can only be described, at least on the face of it, a claim that sounds crazy. Because here's what Jesus says in John 8, verse 51. He says, "Very truly, I tell you," he's saying this to people who are skeptical of him, "whoever obeys my word will never see death." Now, here's the reason that claim is crazy. It does not take a PhD in biology to realize that the mortality rate, okay, of human beings hovers right around, anybody know, 100%, right? Yeah. We all know this. In fact, back in the first century, in Jesus' day and age, the average lifespan, you know what it was? 35. There was a high infant mortality rate. There were diseases and plagues that killed off literally millions of people. People saw death all around them. People tasted death all the time. And yet, here's this guy who shows up And he says, hey, if you just obey my word, you're never going to taste death. Now, the response of Jesus' detractors to the seemingly crazy statement is actually pretty good. Because it's a pretty insightful argument. Here's how they argue against what Jesus has just said. What they do is they appeal to their history. And they go way back to the founder of the Jewish nation, a guy named Abraham. And here's what they say. John 8, verse 52. Abraham was a guy who definitely obeyed God's word. You know what happened to Abraham? He died. Okay, the prophets in the Old Testament, they were people who proclaimed God's word. You know what happened to the prophets? They died. Yeah, Jesus, you say that whoever obeys your word will never taste death. Now, come on. Do you think you're greater than our father Abraham? And then they reiterate what they just said. Abraham died, so did the prophets. And then they ask this very insightful and pointed question. Just who do you think you are? Now, Jesus' answer to this question turns this whole conversation upside down. Because any semblance of civility that's going on inside this conversation, once Jesus answers this question, is out the window. Because here's what Jesus says in verse 58. He says, very truly, I tell you, before Abraham was even born, before he was even around, I am. There's our name for today. Now, when this is what Jesus has to say, the people in the story go ballistic. Here's what they do. Verse 59, at this, they picked up stones to stone Jesus, but Jesus was able to hide himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. Now, you read this story, and the whole story can sound a little just odd, right? Because here's Jesus, he's making these crazy claims about you, just obey my words, you're never going to taste death. And then here are these people, and when Jesus says this little phrase, I am, they go ballistic and they try to throw stones at him. What's going on in this story? Why are the people in this story so upset at Jesus? It's because Jesus is making a claim with this name. I am. And what I want to do in the balance of the time that we have remaining in this message is just unpack the claim that Jesus makes with this name, because Jesus is revealing something profound about his identity and, by the way, our identities. And so two claims that Jesus makes with this name. And the first claim that Jesus makes with this name is that he's God. When Jesus uses this name of himself, when he says, I am, Jesus is claiming to be nothing less and no one else other than God. Now, to understand how Jesus is making this claim, we got to back up about 1,500 years to that first story that we read in Exodus chapter 3. It's a story from the life and times of Moses, one of the most famous characters in the history of the Old Testament. And Moses in Exodus chapter 3 has kind of fallen on hard times. Some of you may know this. Moses kind of grew up with a charmed childhood. He grew up in the lap of luxury. He actually grew up as royalty. He grew up in Egypt in the household of Pharaoh, who was the ruler of Egypt. And so Moses had it all. He was able to do it all until one day Moses has a more than a little run-in with the law, because he murders a government official of Pharaoh. And that's a capital crime. And so back then, capital crimes got capital punishment. And so Moses doesn't want to face the music, so he runs away. And in Exodus chapter 3, he winds up in a region called Horeb. Now, a little bit of technical work here for you. The Old Testament written in Hebrew, and this word Horeb, this place name is actually a Hebrew word that means wasteland. And Moses' address, Horeb, actually kind of describes the state of Moses' life, because that's pretty much what Moses' life has become. It's become a wasteland. He's lost it all. He's gone from being royalty in Pharaoh's household to being in rags. He's gone from being rich when he was a kid to being a ranch hand because he's tending sheep for his father-in-law. Horeb in Moses' mind is horrible. He thinks he's just kind of come to the end of his life. Well, one day as Moses is doing his ranching job in Horeb, he sees off in the distance kind of a brush fire. And this would not have been uncommon in the ancient world. Horeb, just so you know this, annually gets about 1.5 inches of rain. That's per year. Think about that, okay? You get a storm that comes through here, and sometimes you can get 1.5 inches of rain per hour. They get that all year long in Horeb. And so the whole place is a tinderbox. Doesn't take a lot to start a fire. He sees this brush fire off in the distance. But Moses notices something kind of strange about this brush fire. Exodus 3, verse 2, Moses noticed that though the bush, this bush that was on fire, this brush that was on fire, was burning, it did not burn up. Now think about this for just a second. If you see a brush fire on the side of the road, what do you generally do? You drive right by it, right? How long you got to watch a brush fire to realize that it's just going to keep burning and burning and burning and burning? 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 35 minutes, 45 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes before you notice that something is going on and going wrong? Apparently, there's not a whole lot going on in the land of Horeb. You can just kind of stand around and watch things burn. But Moses notices that this bush, this brush just keeps on burning. Finally, Moses gets so curious that he goes to check out the brush fire, and that's when the whole story takes kind of a left turn. Exodus 3, verse 6, Moses goes to look at this brush that's on fire, this bush that's on fire, and what happens? The bush begins to speak, and here's what the bush says: "I'm God." That's odd, right? "I'm the God of your fathers." The God of Abraham, that God that Jesus and his detractors were fighting about in John 8, and the God of Isaac, which would be Abraham's son, and the God of Jacob, which would be Abraham's grandson. And Moses, of course, is a little scared because he's talking to a bush that has just claimed to be God, and so Moses hides his face because he's afraid to look at God. But at the same time Moses is scared, he is also a little curious, because this is kind of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, right? You talk to a brush fire that's claiming to be God, maybe you got a few questions for that brush fire. And so Moses actually has one really specific question. Here's the really specific question: God, what's your name? You see, Moses is living in kind of a polytheistic world. There are all these gods and all these goddesses. They all do these different things, and they all have these different names. In the land of Canaan, there was a god named Baal. He was the storm god. There was also a god named Anat. She was actually a goddess. She was the goddess of hunting. Where Moses grew up in Egypt, they had all sorts of gods and goddesses. They had Osiris. He was the god of the underworld. You saw him when you died. They had Seth. That was the god of violence. You took him with you into battle. And so Moses says, okay, how about you, O God burning in a bush? What's your name? And here's what God says. Exodus 3, verse 14. Our name for today, again, I am. I am who I am. This is my name, God says, forever. Now, as I said, I know that name sounds a little strange, but it actually reveals something about the nature and about the character of God. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it, because human beings, we're all finite, right? Our lives have a beginning and they have an end. There's a time that is before us and there's a time that is after us, and then there's a time that we exist. But that's not true with God. There's no time that is a time before God. There's never going to be a time that is a time after God. God simply exists. He just is. Or from God's perspective, here's the way he would say it: I just am. And that's why he uses this name of himself. To say, no matter what point in history you meet me, I'm the God who exists, and I'm the God who will be there for you. Now, all of a sudden, it begins to make a little bit more sense when Jesus, back to John 8, uses this name when he says, before Abraham was even born, I am. Now his claim begins to really inflame the people. And it makes sense why. Because here's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, hey, before Abraham was around, I am. You know how y'all divide the calendar into BC and AD? Yeah, that's actually not a thing. because there was no time before me. There's no time before Christ. At least eternally, I always have been, I always will be, and I am right now. I am, here's what they're hearing, God. And when Jesus makes that claim, they go ballistic because in their minds, Jesus has just committed blasphemy. Because you can't just try to steal God's identity. And so they pick up stones to throw at him. You know, part of the reason I love that story in John 8 so much is because what the people in John 8 struggled with, people still struggle with today, right? Maybe you've had this question. Maybe you got a child, a grandchild, a relative, coworker, friend who struggles with this same question too. Jesus, I believe he was a good dude, moral teacher, historically significant figure, but he can't really be God. Can he? This question is as old as the Bible itself. Now, if you struggle with that question or you know somebody who struggles with that question, let me give you just one way to think about this, okay? The people in John 8, they struggled with Jesus' identity as God, but they could not deny Jesus' actions. They couldn't deny that Jesus was able to heal people. They saw people walking around who used to have leprosy and now were clean, who used to be blind and now they could see. They couldn't deny Jesus' miracles. They saw like 5,000 people who were fed with a little bit of bread and some fish. They couldn't even deny that Jesus raised people from the dead because there were people who were clearly dead and they were walking around in Israel. Now, you've heard the old saying, right? If it talks like a duck and walks like a duck and looks like a duck, what is it? It's a duck. Okay, so if Jesus talks like God and walks like God and looks like God and can do things that only God can do, what does that make Jesus? God. Because nobody else can do that kind of stuff. That's the claim when Jesus uses this name. He's saying, I am God. Now, that's not the only claim that Jesus makes when he uses this name. Here's the second claim that Jesus makes when he uses this name. He not only claims to be God, Jesus also claims to be one of us. When Jesus uses this name, part of what he's saying is, I'm just like you. Back to Exodus 3, kind of an interesting detail in the story. Exodus 3, verse 2, when the Lord appears to Moses in flames of fire from within a bush. I want you to pick up on that word bush, okay? A little bit more Hebrew work here for you. The Hebrew word behind this word for bush is the word seneh, and this describes a specific kind of bush. It describes a thorn bush. And when you pause to think about that, you kind of got to ask yourself, couldn't God have chosen a better place to reveal himself to Moses, right? Maybe along a lazy river, that would have been nice. Under a real nice shady fruit tree, could have had a snack and had a conversation. Okay, here's where God chooses to reveal himself to Moses, in a place that is very hot because it's on fire, and in a place that is very pokey because it's a thorn bush, right? Couldn't God have gone for something a little bit more comfortable? But actually, how God chooses to reveal himself to Moses says something about God's heart for Moses. Because here's the reality. You know how Moses' life feels at this point in time? Very thorny. Very thorny. Because he's gone from being royalty to living in rags. He's gone from being rich to being a ranch hand. His life is just like Horeb. It's a complete and utter wasteland. And yet what God does is he says, okay, I'll come into your thorns and I will be there for you. You ever feel like your life gets thorny too? Maybe your life is a little thorny with your family, right? You're struggling with your husband, with your wife, with your kids. Can't even have a civil conversation. Maybe your life is a little thorny at work. Your boss, right? Your coworkers, they're kind of frustrating. Maybe it's your own body that's feeling thorny. You felt that lump where there wasn't a lump before, and now you have all those oncology appointments and you're undergoing all those treatments. When God reveals himself to us, he doesn't just reign over us, he actually comes into the thorns with us. Which is why 1,500 years after Moses, when God comes again, do you remember what he shows up in? Back to John 8 for just a second. Jesus' detractors, they try to throw stones at him. Now, he gets away, but they eventually get him, right? Because they eventually arrest him, and they eventually drag him into a court, and they eventually bring charges against him, and they eventually get him convicted. And when the bailiff hauls him away, and soldiers come to take him, to put him on a cross, what do? In John 19, verse 2, the soldiers twist together a crown of what? Thorns. Because that's what God shows up in. And they put it on his head. It turns out that this name, I Am, is not just about glory and majesty and special effects. It's also about sin and shame and pain. All of that is wrapped up in this one name. I am. In fact, if you grew up in church, you may have heard it put this way. Jesus is true God. He has all the glory and all the majesty, but he's also true man. All of that is wrapped up in this one name. I am. Now, before we wrap up, there is one more question we got to ask and answer, which is this, okay? All of that is very important theology. But what does the theology mean for you and for me? How can this name actually transform our lives? Where's the power for us in this name? Now, to answer that question, we need to take a look at one more part of the story from Exodus chapter 3. Okay? And it's actually a part that we skipped over when we were doing the reading, so I'm gonna kind of tease it out for you now. When Moses is going to this burning brush fire, to this burning bush, before God reveals his name to Moses, God actually makes a request of Moses as Moses is approaching this burning bush. Here's the request. Exodus 3, verse 5, God says to Moses, all right, before you get here, take off your sandals. For the place where you are standing is holy ground. Now, I'm going to be old-fashioned here for just a second, okay, if you'll forgive me. We're going to go way back to the old King James Version because I like the King James Version translation of this passage. Here's how God says it in the King James Version, Exodus 3, verse 5. He uses his best Elizabethan English, and he says, put off thy shoes, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Now, it's in this request that this name gets very relevant and very practical for us, this name I Am. Think about it this way. When Moses hears the name of God, here's what he's doing. He's standing before a burning bush barefoot. You guys ever heard the saying, shoes make the man? Actually, it's usually clothes make the man, right? But back when the King James Version was actually translated, the saying was really shoes make the man. Because back in that era, you could tell a man just by the shoes he wore. If they were nice shoes, he was rich. If the soles were coming out of the shoes, he was poor. You could tell what a man did just by the shoes that he walked around in. You guys like shoes? Anybody collect shoes? Like you got a whole closet full of them, right? Brought some of my shoes here this morning. I'll start with my favorite pair of shoes, okay? These I wear all the time. My most comfortable pair of work boots. I love these things. And you know what? Maybe these are your shoes too, and maybe these shoes say something about you. Maybe you fashion yourself to be a hard-working woman or a hard-working man. You come in early and you stay late. You work your fingers to the bone and you keep your nose to the grindstone, right? These are your shoes. Now, of course, if you're honest with yourselves, you not only work hard, you work too hard, and you're just working yourself into an early grave. You're exhausted, you're tired, you're spent all the time. Are these your shoes? Is this who you are? Because if so, a burning bush would like to have a word with you. Okay? And you know what the burning bush will say to you? Put off thy shoes. You don't have to work yourself into the ground. You don't have to be that kind of woman or that kind of man. And here's why. Because I am. I am, God says, your rest. Okay. Maybe these are your shoes. Okay? All right, so I'll be completely honest. I have very high life aspirations. When I retire, I want to be a beach bum. That's my high life aspiration, okay? So I'm saving these for that moment, okay? I love the surf. I love the sand. Maybe you do too. And maybe these are the shoes that define you. Maybe for you, work is just something you do between the weekends. You love to have a good time. And you love to party. Now, you may party a little too hard, so the next morning you're waking up feeling kind of lousy, right? And you know it's wrong, so there's a little bit of guilt and a little bit of shame and a little bit of pain that's involved in all of that. Are these your shoes? If so, you don't have to raise your hand for this, okay? It's all right. If so, there's a burning bush who would like to have a word with you. And you know what the burning bush will say to you? Put off thy shoes. I know you're spending your whole life trying to chase a good time and be happy, but you don't have to be that kind of woman or be that kind of man. And here's why. It's because I am. I am, God says, your joy. One more pair. Maybe these are your shoes, dress shoes. These are a little dusty. Probably should wear them more often and shine them more often. But maybe you wear these all the time. Because you do believe that clothes make the man and shoes make the man, and so you always want to put your best foot forward. You want to look together because you want everybody to think that you have it all together. But truth be told, no matter how good you may look when you walk into church on a Sunday morning, no matter how many awesome social media pictures you may post, as soon as the camera stops, as soon as you head to the house, there are parts and pieces of you that are falling apart. And you're not sure that you can keep up the charade. Is that your life, or are these your shoes? If so, there's a burning bush who would like to have a word with you. And you know what that burning bush will say to you? He'll say, I am. You don't have to be that kind of woman or that kind of man because I am your righteousness. You see, here's why this name I am is so important for us. This name I am is so important for us because it says something about us. Here's what it says, okay? When God says I am, you know what that means? You're not. That's what that means. You're not righteous like God. You're not holy like God. You're not noble like God. You're not perfect like God. You don't have it all together like God. But here's the promise. That's still okay. Because in that name, I am. God wants to share all that he is with you. And to get all of that, there's nothing you have to do. Just trust in him. So, who are you? Whoever you are. God's name is greater than your name. Because everything that you're not, God is. Or, as he would say it, I am. That's Jesus' claim. And you know what? There's incredible power in that name.